Did you know you can stitch using only one color of thread and get beautiful results? Join me today as I slow stitch 3 collages using only black, red, and off-white. The resulting pieces are full of texture, variation, and a special kind of unity that only one color can create. And stay to the end to see me use these 3 collages to create a touchable and functional jar cover. I'm going to jump right into slow stitching and start with a patchwork collage. Later on in the video, I'm going to show my method for basting my collage. And if you want to take a deeper dive into my method for creating a collage and basting it in place so it's ready for slow stitching, then check out the video that I've linked below. Let's get started. Today, the collages I'm stitching on are each 3 by 3 inches, and I'll be using an embroidery needle and 2 strands of the 6-stranded embroidery floss throughout the projects. Here I've made a simple collage of fabrics, and I'm taking 2 strands of ecru, which is an off-white color, and I'm going to create running stitches. I'm starting up in this corner, but you can really start anywhere. The 2 ways that I create the running stitch are to stitch on the top of the piece, stacking up the stitches, and then pulling the thread through. And you can also do a stab stitch style where you're stitching 1 stitch at a time, taking the thread all the way to the back, and then bringing it back through. In terms of appearance, these 2 types of stitches are the same. So I'm creating a few rows along the top, going straight across, and then I'm going to vary the direction of my stitches. I'm filling this with running stitches. I've changed direction a few times, and I'm going to keep going, filling in the area that's left. So now I've covered this piece in this off-white color, and I'm going to add blanket stitching around the edges, also in this same off-white color. You can start anywhere to create your blanket stitch. I like to start in the middle of one of the sides. So I make a knot and attach my thread at the back. I bring the thread to the front and I begin to create the blanket stitch. I hold the thread in my left hand while I take a stitch on the front of the piece, pulling the thread to create a loop. And then I move to my right and I create another stitch, continuing to hold that thread in the left, pulling the stitch through and creating my next loop. The blanket stitching just around this one part, you can see how it's pulling everything together. It's creating more of a defined shape. And because it's the same color, it's really blending in quite nicely with all of the other stitching. So I'm going to continue around this piece, working the blanket stitch all the way around to where I started and joining it to that first stitch. So here it is. You can see how I have varied the length and the intensity of the stitches. I varied the direction, and it's added so much texture and interest. This is all with one color. You can see how it reacts differently with the very dark saturated colors and the lighter colors, and how it brings the whole piece together. So now let's see what kind of results we can get working in a different color. So with this collage of fabrics, I'm going to stitch it with red. The colors I've chosen for this are not quite as deep and as saturated, and that's because the red is a very deep color in itself. So I don't want it to compete with the collage colors. So I'm going to do the same thing, and I'm going to make running stitches in different directions on this piece. It's going to look very different because it's all going to be in red. If I was to use an off-white color on this, it would tone down all the colors. Because I'm using red, it's going to really contrast in some areas and blend in others. So it's a very different choice to make than using a white or an off-white color. I'm starting to create my running stitches in the corner, but of course you could start anywhere. So just with these first few stitches, you can tell how much the stitching shows up and adds to this collage. So using red is a really bold choice. So this is really changing the whole look of the collage. This red color is very powerful. It's very exciting to see it start to come together. I'm going to continue varying the direction of my stitches and fill in these final areas with red. So now my stitching in red is complete with my blanket stitching on the edges. You can really see how this has brought out all the pink, red tones and contrasted with the blue. It's a really nice effect. I've created this collage on a piece of black felt, pinned it in place with applique pins, and now I'm going to baste everything down using regular sewing thread. This is my preferred method for basting. I like to take the pins out as quickly as possible, and I like the fact that if I change my mind and I want to move something, it's very easy to do when I've basted with thread. So I've basted down these pieces. This is what it looks like on the back, jumping around with the stitches. And on the front, I've taken very small stitches. So now this is in place. I still am able to move things around somewhat, and I'm ready to begin my stitching. And for this patchwork piece, I'm going to stitch in black. So by now you know the method, creating running stitches and varying the direction, covering the entire piece. And I continue to stop and evaluate and have a look at my progress and make decisions about the direction of my next rows of stitching. So I'm almost complete here, just some small areas to fill in. So I've completed the stitching on this, including adding blanket stitch on the border. And one thing I want to point out as an option here is to add more stitching in some areas. You can see on this one, there's some areas where the stitches are closer together, other areas where they're farther apart. And it's nice to have a variation of stitches. Just adds a little bit more interest. You can see on this piece, the stitching is fairly uniform. So this piece also could benefit from having some places where I either place the stitches close together, similar to here, or even do some crosses or plus signs, which is very doable at this point. So I'm working on this piece. I've just finished my blanket stitch and I have some thread left on my needle. So I'm going to come back in and add some more stitching, just in a few areas. And then, similar to this piece, I'm going to come back in and add some more on this red with red thread. So you can see what this extra stitching has added. It's a nice contrast between the different areas. So I'm going to do the same thing here, adding more stitches, and we'll see what develops with this red thread. So I'm going to go with the idea of adding the plus signs. So to do that, I just find some stitches where I think it would look nice to change the shape of the stitch, making sure I have enough room, and crossing that stitch, turning it into a cross. I think it's nice to add these stitches in little groupings, so I'm going to do that all over this piece. So some stitches closer together, and then crossing the stitches here and making plus signs. It's added a bit of variety. As you can see, this piece with the stitching closer together, adding something. The crosses are adding something. And with this piece, shorter stitches closer together, varying the spacing of the stitches has added something as well. So I'm quite happy with this experiment. One color stitched on a collage. They're very different. There's something about each one that I really like. And now I'm going to join these three pieces together and create a beautiful project with them. So I stitched these three together. And to do that, I placed the wrong sides together and I created a blanket stitch to join them. I'll show you how I did that to join this final side. What I want to do with this is wrap it around a jar. This is a mason jar that I use to keep some extra needles and things in. And these three stitched panels are the right size to fit around it. And the height is nice because this is a mason jar. This cozy will not affect if I want to add a lid. So I decided to use red thread to attach these. I could have used black here. I could have used white here. Each one would create a nice effect. So for this final side that I want to stitch together, I could use the off-white color that I had used here, or I could use black. I'm going to use the off-white. So I'm going to create a blanket stitch starting here and going across to here. I'm attaching my thread at the back, right in the corner, and I'll put these two pieces wrong sides together. So the pretty sides are facing out. And I'm going to take a stitch. I'm going to keep my stitches about the same length as these ones, going through on this side and then matching up and coming out on the other side, keeping my thread to the left so that I'm pulling the thread through the loop. And I'm going to continue this way all the way across. Going in between stitches and making sure I'm coming down. I don't want to come down farther than these stitches. I'm coming down a little above where these black blanket stitches are. Holding this thread to the left. Coming in and taking my stitch. This is just one way to join these. You could use an invisible stitch, you could use a ladder stitch. There's so many options. This blanket stitch creates a bit of a bump on the join. So maybe depending on the fabrics you're using and the look you're going for, you may not want to have this bump, this ridge that's created. You may want a flatter seam. So in that case, perhaps using a ladder stitch would work. You can really personalize all of this, even down to this last detail. Coming to the end here, and I want to take my last stitch as close to the corner as I can. There's my seam. I'm going to go inside. Take my needle down to the inside. And I'll knot off here. So you can see there's a little ridge, a little bump. I think of it as some extra interest and texture, and I'm not trying to hide the fact that these are separate pieces. So now I just need to slip this onto my jar. The size is just perfect. It's easy to slip in here. It's tight enough that it's not going to come off. The black stitches really highlight the colors in the patchwork. It's a gorgeous dramatic effect. And the red is so bold and cheerful. And then the subtlety of the off-white stitching on those solid fabrics. I love how the jar looks different depending on the angle you see it from. Even the seam areas are nice to look at. I hope this has given you some ideas about stitching in one color and the possibilities. And also to not be afraid to take different pieces and stitch them together. Thank you so much for joining me. Until next time, happy stitching.